John Wayne Gacy was caught in 1979, and 6 years later, Stephen King released It, the novel about a killer clown that hunted kids from the sewers. Coincidence? I think not. Only, the real Pogo the Clown and the boys he buried under the crawl space of his house is much, much more terrifying than a fictional shapeshifter living under Derry. This is the story of John Wayne Gacy, America's most vile child killer. And you're tuned into Evidence Obscured, the place where the monsters are real and the truth is revealed, no matter how repulsive it is. Let's get into it. As the middle child and only son of John Gacy and Marion Robeson, Gacy was an unathletic and chubby boy who was both spoiled and terribly abused. John Sr. was a war vet and a raging alcoholic who belittled and beat his son mercilessly. To him, his son was a sissy, a failure, and he never missed an opportunity to tell Gacy that every day of his life. But on the flip side, Marion often shielded her son from her husband's drunken rages, and between her and his sisters, Gacy was adored to distraction. At the age of 11, he was struck on the head with a swing. For the next 5 years, he suffered from blackouts, headaches, and dizzy spells. Unfortunately, John Sr. wouldn't allow his son to seek medical help for what they'd later discover was a blood clot that formed in his brain thanks to that swing. He accused Gacy of being an attention-seeking sissy, a weakling and a failure. The clot was successfully treated, and on top of all that, Gacy was diagnosed with a heart condition too. Needless to say, John Sr. would much rather have had a different son than the one he got, and he never let Gacy forget it. Thanks to the many hospital visits, he wasn't any great shakes at school, but he was a phenomenal liar. He told big, fanciful tales and had a knack for talking himself and his buddies out of trouble. Gacy might not have been terribly handsome or academically inclined, but he sure was charming. On top of all of this abuse, illness, and constant belittling, a friend of the family sexually abused Gacy in his early teens too. So brain damage, abuse, and sexual abuse, yeah, the kid hit the trauma ground running at full speed. In 1960, when Gacy was 18, John Sr. gave him a car and promptly took away the keys because Gacy took up a job as an assistant precinct captain for a local Democratic Party candidate. John was a Republican, and this was seen as an egregious betrayal from his pathetic son. When Gacy got the keys back, he got into the car and drove to Las Vegas that same day. He took a job as a janitor at a mortuary and spent many nights with only dead bodies for company. One night, he crawled into a coffin of a teenage boy to abuse the corpse. The incident both excited and frightened Gacy, so much that he quit that job and went to college to hopefully take his mind off the nagging fantasies about dead boys and sex. And for a while there, it worked. His forays into business studies and his smart mouth finally gave Gacy a place where he was good at something. He met and married Marilyn Myers, managed 3 of her father's KFC restaurants, and was deeply involved in charitable events. At just 25, Gacy was already earning more than his father and had 2 children. And here's where Gacy begins to lead a secret life. Behind the fundraisers, the massive salary, the nice house, and the picturesque, wholesome family portrait, he was even elected as the president of the JCs, a youth-centered organization that organized charitable events and helped young men find work. The perfect place for Gacy to recruit victims and a great stepping stone for someone who aspired to get into politics. Gacy started a club for the employees of the KFCs that he managed and a few hand-picked kids from the JC's organization. Only teenagers were invited to this special club of his. He'd ply them with booze before making sexual advances toward the teenagers. If he was refused, he'd laugh it off as a joke, or he'd tell them that he was testing their morals. Typical grooming behavior, but that wasn't enough. In '67, Gacy lured a 16-year-old into the same basement. He drew a knife and forced the boy into handcuffs and onto a bed where he nearly choked him to death. This became his MO with dozens of kids. Eventually, after enough kids came forward to report the assaults, beatings, and forceful confinement, Gacy was brought in. He insisted that the teenagers were lying and that his position as the president of the JCs was contested by his competition, and they were trying to smear his name. Nevertheless, he failed a polygraph, and 2 separate psychiatrists diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder. By the time he was found guilty on 1 charge of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in prison, his wife and kids had left him. He never saw them again. But there, he did what he always did. He played the model prisoner. He recruited 250 men into the JC organization in less than 2 years, became head chef, petitioned to increase prisoners' pay, bettered their living conditions, got them a mini golf course on the grounds, and he completed several college courses. No one was surprised when he was granted early release, having served only 18 months. When John Wayne Gacy walked out of that prison in 1970, he vowed to never return to jail. He assaulted 2 more teenagers in Chicago, but both times the charges were dropped, so the parole board was never made aware of his crimes. In 1972, Gacy moved into the now infamous house on 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, Illinois. And there, with no guards or metal bars to keep the monster caged, Gacy finally did what he'd been gearing up to for the past 29 years. He became a murderer. He picked up 15-year-old Timothy McCoy from a bus station. Timothy spent the night with Gacy willingly, and when Gacy woke the next morning, Timothy was next to his bed holding a knife. Tim had laid out breakfast and had come in to wake Gacy for the meal, absent-mindedly, still holding the knife he used to cut bread. Gacy reacted like a bomb went off. He took the knife from Timothy and stabbed him repeatedly in the chest. While Tim lay dying, gasping for breath, Gacy calmly cleaned the knife, found the breakfast laid out, and that's where he decided that death was the ultimate thrill. Gone were the days when his victims could report him to police. Never again would a boy leave that house in Norwood Park alive, and he knew that he'd never find a more sexually gratifying experience with a willing participant like he'd had when he heard Timothy's labored gurgles as his lungs slowly drowned in blood. He buried Timothy in the crawl space under the house. The space was so low that any grave was extremely shallow, but at least for now, Timothy had vanished from the face of the earth, and Gacy was about to get married for a second time to a single mother of 2. He opened a business, PDM Contractors, that employed young men, teaching them construction, painting, maintenance, and general blue-collar skills. He volunteered at the Democratic Party, organized parades, and even met First Lady Rosalind Carter. And on his days off, Gacy hosted huge barbecues for up to 300 people at a time. Grills, jumping castles, and even personal entertainment. For these events, Gacy appeared as Pogo the Clown, goofball entertainer who did the most amazing magic tricks for the little ones. What a stand-up guy. What a pillar of the community. Just a good old chap who looked out for lost boys and Norwood Park's personal hero, and a total creep behind closed doors. It took him 4 years after that first murder, but now he had the perfect system in place. The construction company to recruit victims, a community that expected parties and get-togethers, and everyone knew he could do cool magic tricks. Every young man that walked into that house fully expected to be entertained by a jolly, round-faced man who was known to everyone and whom everyone liked. Sometime in 1974, he picked up another boy, and strangely, Gacy, who never shied away from going into grisly details, never wanted to say much about this young man. All we know is that he was between 14 and 18 years old, had dark blonde hair, and whatever Gacy did to him inside that house of horror led to his death. Gacy buried him in the backyard. A year later, 18-year-old John Butkovich, an employee of Gacy's, disappeared. Gacy had convinced him to come inside the house to collect an overdue check. He gave John a drink and told him that he wanted to show him a magic trick with some handcuffs. John allowed Gacy to cuff his hands behind his back, and that's where Gacy flipped that carnivorous switch. He strangled John to death and buried him under the tool room next to his garage. In '76, he killed 14 young men, all aged between 14 and 18, with his wife and stepdaughters right inside that house, completely clueless that they were living and walking over dead bodies. Daniel Sampson, Randall Reffett, then the youngest victim at 14, Samuel Stapleton, Michael Bonin, William Carroll, Rick Johnston, James Hackinson, Kenneth Parker, Michael Marino, William Bundy, Francis Alexander, and Gregory Godzik. 2 sets of remains later found are suspected to have occurred in '76 too, but they've never been identified. The shtick was always the same: pick up a boy hitchhiking or a runaway that hung around the gay scene of Chicago, load them up with booze, and then convince them to have their hands tied behind their backs for another cool magic trick. Then Gacy would pounce on them, strangle them to death while he assaulted them, and bury them in the crawl space under the house. When his wife complained about the smell that was starting to emanate from under the house, he'd tell her that the drainage system in Chicago was old and that sewage was getting backed up in the underground pipes. Can you imagine the smell of a dozen bodies oozing into the foundations? How that woman accepted that excuse is beyond me. The gay community in Chicago were becoming aware that young men were disappearing, but as you probably might expect, the police weren't too fussy about a few Nancy boy runaways going missing. In '78, 10 more went missing. John Cizik, John Prestige, Matthew Bowman, Robert Gilroy, John Mowry, Russell Nelson, Robert Winch, Tommy Balling, David Talsama, and another unidentified teenager, all buried under the crawl space that was slowly starting to ooze into the foundations and turning the soil into sludge. Still, every guest in Gacy's family totally believed that old sewage was to blame for the horrendous smell. More than once, police had the chance to look into Gacy further. 2 parents of missing boys reported that their sons had been promised jobs at Gacy's construction company. Gacy also sold another victim's car and was questioned by police about it, but shook them off by telling them that the boy wanted to run away and sold the car for cash. Yet another victim was the son of a police officer. Still, Gacy managed to weasel his way out of every single interrogation. But '78 was going to start catching up to him. The police couldn't ignore the fact that they had more than 20 kids on their board who'd gone missing, and about 50,000 gay men making as much noise as they could about their missing friends. The police might not have cared much about it, but damn it, not even the law could silence the gay community of Chicago. We know of 5 more men in 1978 whose lives ended in that house. William Kindred, Timothy O'Rourke, Robert Landington, James Mazzara, and another unidentified victim. But Gacy was getting sloppy. The situation with the mounting corpses under the crawl space was becoming unmanageable. Gacy had now buried 26 bodies under there. He literally didn't have space left to bury more. So he started dumping them in the Des Plaines River. Police can ignore a couple of missing runaways and queers from Boys Town, but they couldn't ignore bodies with clear signs of torture washing up in their city. Then there's the survivors. First, he kidnapped Jeffrey Rignall and held him captive for 24 hours. During that time, he kept Jeffrey sedated with so much chloroform that he was almost comatose most of the time. He beat him mercilessly, assaulted him, and honestly, it's a miracle that Jeffrey didn't end up in the crawl space himself. For some reason, Gacy let Jeffrey go, dropping him off in Lincoln Park. And Jeffrey wasn't the only one to be let go either. Robert Donnelly was kidnapped at gunpoint and drowned repeatedly until he lost consciousness, only to be revived for more beatings and more drownings. The pain was so excruciating that Robert begged for Gacy to just kill him. But Gacy just replied, "Aren't we playing some fun games tonight?" Again, Gacy released him. After he got caught, 8 men were found to have experienced the same thing, but they never reported it to the police. And I don't blame them. Look how much police cared about the gay community's fears in their now 3-year plight for help. These guys weren't going to be taken seriously, and they knew it. The 2 that did go to the police were shown away. No reports were filed, and Gacy wasn't even questioned about it at all. Then, Gacy kidnapped Robert Piest. Big mistake. Robert was a good kid from a close-knit family, and he was taken from the parking lot of the pharmacy where he worked, while his mother waited inside the store to drive him home after his shift. Even more damning, the store's owner saw Gacy around and recognized him.
Lies. I said, "This is ludicrous."
But the jury didn't find it ludicrous. After barely 2 hours deliberation, its verdict was murder by Gacy, 33 times, 29 bodies.
We sell houses at night. On Christmas Eve, we will serve cookies and hot chocolate to the men in the cell.
Gacy was rather well known in the community after all. Despite police's quick response, they were too late. Robert was already dead an hour after his abduction. Police arrived and Gacy allowed them to walk around the place. Since they had no warrant, they couldn't exactly search the place, and it was in the middle of winter, so they didn't smell the rot coming from below. But they did spy a few personal items that they recognized as belonging to some of the missing boys they'd been looking for. That was enough to justify a warrant, and then all hell broke loose. Whatever they were expecting, it wasn't this. That crawl space was so filled with bodies that there were places where their boots were submerged up to the ankles in maggots.
Bree was first discovered on a cold December day when the first of his victims were found in the crawl space beneath his home. They were taken out.
Gacy confession about how he killed his victims. Strangled them with his now... Nobody knows, but the psychiatrists talk about how obsessive and meticulous he is, enough to kill repeatedly and to...
The 6 bodies bring the total found under this house and garage to 15. All appearing to have been teenaged boys and young men. And police, digging cautiously with garden tools, say they've now covered only 1/4 of the space under the house. David?
29 bodies, 3 in the backyard and 26 under the house. And that's not counting the ones that were thrown in the Des Plaines River. That's 33 victims that we know of and that Gacy admitted to, and 33 lives that could have been saved had the police just kept this monster in jail where he belonged the first time around, or if they bothered to listen to just one of the parents, just one victim, or just one gay activist group. Naturally, a guy like Gacy wasn't going to go down without some theatrics. This lunatic admitted to everything, then recanted everything, but not before he reveled in recalling what he did to those poor boys. He called them human trash and delighted in the fact that he got to walk over their corpses for so long. He went for the insanity plea, but got sentenced to death anyway. Then he contested the verdict for years. He sat down for interviews every chance he got, and when he found out that his clown costume had become a famous point of interest, he sold paintings from his cell. And it gets worse. There's a whole lot of evidence to suggest that Gacy wasn't acting alone. Some of the survivors insisted that there was someone else besides Gacy in that house and that this man was active in their torture. Unfortunately, they were heavily drugged at the time, so their statements were never taken further. The court also did not allow the defense to bring up any of the suspected accomplices. Michael Rossi, Ed Hefner, and David Crane all worked for Gacy and were around that house a lot. Some of the victims went missing while Gacy was out of town, and they usually house sat for Gacy on such occasions. They were also digging trenches at the property more than once. None have been seriously investigated. Then there's John David Norman, who ran one of the largest child trafficking rings in the United States through charitable organizations, and his right-hand man, Philip Paskey. Paskey worked for Gacy, and he hunted kids in Chicago for Norman during that time. Paskey, working for both Gacy and the biggest child trafficker in the country at the time, cannot be a coincidence. I don't care what police say. There's more here than those bodies in the crawl space. Gacy himself admitted to more victims, and he alluded to having accomplices. Unfortunately, Gacy was a dramatic liar with a taste for attention, so it shouldn't be surprising that we never got much more out of him before he was executed via lethal injection in 1994. His last meal was KFC, strawberries, fries, and shrimp. Then he told the executioner, "Kiss my ass," before dying painlessly. Can you imagine? The man who tortured all those boys in the most horrific ways imaginable got to have an indulgent meal and then drift off into death without a drop of blood. That's why I'm religious. I have to believe that true, horrific evil like this will suffer what their victims did in the afterlife. There has to be more justice than what Gacy got. I believe that there were more victims. I'm sure that Gacy had accomplices, and I definitely believe that he's roasting in hell. But I also have a feeling that our chances of finding out the truth is slimmer than the police's interest in the concern of gay men in Chicago in the 70s. All we can hope for now is that the last 5 unidentified victims will eventually be reunited with their families, and that Gacy's got to stick up his porky butt, being roasted down there like the swine that he was. See you in the next one, people.